together as a collection, they help to build a skill set that we're all going to need if we're going to accelerate the transition to a low carbon, climate resilient and inclusive world. So people who are on this call who've heard me speak before know that I don't usually say my own name without a PowerPoint. And so there is a PowerPoint ready to share with you, and I think it's going to be called up on your screen just now. And here we go. Now, I've obviously picked the famous photograph Earthrise, which was taken in the late 60s, 1968, but in a sense became an inspiration for the environmental movement and all of the great advocacy that followed over the subsequent 5 decades. And what I want to do with the first slide that now follows, the key introductory slide in terms of substance, is to talk a little bit about where the world is today, because we know that we've experienced an unprecedented 100 days in terms of crises right around the globe. But what's important, if we circle through this slide, is to understand that what we're actually facing is not one particular crisis, the pandemic, but we're suffering a global crisis that has 3 dimensions. There is the economic crisis that we experience on a daily basis, which includes falling global GDP, which includes a rapid rise in unemployment and the social dislocation that comes with that. It's experiencing a fall in foreign direct investment and in company commitments to global supply chains, which means that developing countries and emerging economies are suffering the brunt of this economic crisis. We're seeing, as a consequence of this, many of the sustainable development goals that we have committed to around poverty eradication and food security falling and taking a dramatic hit as a consequence. But we're also, of course, witnessing on a daily basis the tragedy of a public health emergency. We're seeing not only a significant number of confirmed cases of COVID-19, more than 2.5 million around the globe. We're not only seeing fatalities resulting from those confirmed cases, but we know that the public health emergency is even greater than the confirmed cases. And we know that even people who are not suffering from COVID are suffering premature deaths as a consequence of an overburdened health system. And then the third and final dimension of what we're experiencing right now is the witnessing of global inequality played out in the context of a pandemic. We're seeing, for example, that marginalized communities are suffering first and are being hit hardest, in part because they're suffering from underlying health conditions, in part because they're suffering from various forms of structural discrimination, political, legal, economic, social, and cultural. And we see this particularly playing out, of course, within low-income populations and communities of color. One of the more damning statistics in the United States has been the significant proportion of African Americans who have suffered death as a consequence of COVID, despite being relatively low numbers in terms of population. So when we witness this crisis before our very eyes and we suffer all of the economic, social disconnect that's resulting from this, it is absolutely normal and legitimate that we are seeking to reopen, restart, resuscitate. We're seeking to get our lives back together again. But if we look at the next slide with care, one of the things we have to remember is that the world we inhabited in December 2019, before this crisis unfolded, was also a world of many dimensions of different types of crises. We were also in the midst of an economic crisis, because as a consequence of global climate change, we were on course for devastating financial losses during the course of the coming decades and well before the end of this century. In fact, the Financial Stability Board, a very austere and very eminent global gathering of Federal Reserve and central bank chiefs, were estimating that we would see up to $43 trillion of assets under threat as a consequence of climate change before the end of this century. We also know that there were more than 700 million people around the world living on less than $2 a day. And we know that in the United States alone, more than 40% of the population couldn't accommodate a $400 emergency expense. We also saw, at least if we were watching and paying attention, a different type of public health emergency around the world. Notably, of course, the 9 million people who die premature deaths every year as a result of air pollution, and the millions of people around the world who suffer from food insecurity and preventable diseases. And as with the COVID crisis, this was something that reflected inequality back to us, particularly, again, low-income populations and populations of color. But interestingly, when you look at climate change, you find that women, more than any other population group, are disproportionately impacted and face asymmetrical impacts. And again, this is a consequence of various forms of structural discrimination. So my argument to you is, we cannot simply recreate the economy of December 2019. What we've got to do, instead of reopening, is we've got to reimagine. And what the next slide seeks to do is provide an overview of what a reimagined global economy might look like over the course of the coming decades. Now, many of you who have heard me speak before know that Eleanor Roosevelt is a huge hero of mine. And after the Second World War, she led the global community in creating the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. And every night she went to bed by saying a prayer, asking God to help us save ourselves and make a world made new. And what this new world looks like, as far as I'm concerned, is again three-dimensional. First, we have to have low carbon or net zero carbon. That means we must aspire to holding global mean temperature rises to less than 1.5 degrees Celsius by the mid-century. And that means we must reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 45% by 2050. In order to do that, everybody must act to the limit of their capabilities, with those who have the most capabilities going further, faster. In addition to being low carbon, however, we must enhance resilience, because it's not only important that we avoid unmanageable climate change, it's critical that we manage the unavoidable climate change that is already impacting our communities. That means we must invest in the human, social, natural, physical, financial, and political capital that builds resilience and adaptive capacity, but it also means that our attention must focus on the most vulnerable populations, the frontline communities that experience climate events on a weekly basis. And then finally, we must build an inclusive world. That means strengthening civil and political rights, because when you have access to information, decision-making, and justice, you have the tools necessary to begin the process of resilience building. But it also means we must build a shared prosperity. We must tackle these issues of inequality that have torn us apart and made some of us more vulnerable. And finally, we must build a just transition, meaning our new climate economy must not exclude those people who are currently invested in a high carbon economy. We must invite those communities in coal country and in oil country to join this new climate economy with us. So if we move to the next slide, what I've tried to do this evening is to curate a list of books that helps to explain the world we've inhabited and helps to equip us with the skill set we need to begin to build the foundations of the world we want to see. A caveat is that these are not necessarily the best books. They are books that I myself have read, and they are books that I myself value in terms of building my own skill set. Those who've heard me speak before know that I try to be the eternal optimist and often caution against becoming sunk in the coming apocalypse. But that being said, I don't think you could possibly talk about the climate crisis without having at least one title that deals with the coming apocalypse. And as a consequence, I've chosen a book by David Wallace Wells called The Uninhabitable Earth. The reason I've chosen this particular book as opposed to some of the other possible titles is because he has been quite rigorous in trying to build a book that reads like a thriller, but on the most robust evidence base. He has used, for example, the peer-reviewed and published learning accumulated by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change to tell the story that unfolds in this book. And it is a story about how climate change is real, how it's caused by human activities, how it's undermining natural systems, how it's impacting human systems such as jobs, mobility, human rights, and health, but how ultimately it is solvable if we take the right steps over the coming years. The second book that I've decided to recommend to you this evening is not a climate book at all. It is a book about gender empowerment and gender inequality, and it's written by Nicholas Kristof and his wife Cheryl Wu Dunn, and the book is called Half the Sky. The reason why this book is so important is because it brings home to all of us how asymmetrical impacts occur as a consequence of structural discrimination. Climate is very, very rarely mentioned in this book, but each chapter is an unfolding story of how political, social, economic, legal, and cultural discrimination affect the lives of women around the world, and how when you empower women and enhance their resilience, you not only change the lives of individuals, but you change the destiny of households, communities, and in fact, the whole world. So this book has been chosen to really emphasize the fact that while we are all at risk from climate change, some of us face heightened vulnerability. The third book that I've chosen go ahead, is by Jane Meyer. And this book is called Dark Money. And the reason I've chosen this particular book is because we often ask ourselves the question, if we have known about climate change for so long, and in fact, President Lyndon Johnson was the first US president to receive a report on climate change back in 1965. So if we have known about this issue for so long, and if we understand the urgency of our need to address it, why indeed have we not done more, and why did we not act sooner? The reason why I'm recommending this book to you is because it gives a very clear-eyed account of the type of opposition that is ranged against those of us who are trying to build a low-carbon, resilient, and inclusive world. It talks about the methods that have been used for elite capture within our politics. It talks about the methods that have been used in order to create the idea that there is in fact no consensus within the science. It reveals that if we want to save the climate, we must first work on saving our democracy. We must, for example, work on campaign finance. We must seek to overcome things like Citizens United that has not only polluted our politics, but led to the continuing pollution of our atmosphere. So this book is an insight into how climate denial and skepticism works, the resources that they have at our disposal, and the ways in which we have to respond to that. The next book I've chosen, go ahead, is called The Idea of Justice. And this is by an Indian philosopher called Amartya Sen, who is an eminent philosopher working at Oxford University and has done tremendous work over many decades to enhance our understanding of various types of philosophical schools of thought. The reason why I've chosen this particular book is because I am personally convinced that over the next 10 years and even beyond, it is not enough for us to focus our attention on decarbonization. If all we do over the coming decade is change the chemical composition of the atmosphere back to quote unquote normal levels, we will still have a world where 22,000 children die of hunger every day. We will still have a world where there are 60 to 100 million disappeared women. So it's not enough for us to take a natural sciences perspective on this problem. We actually have to have a vision of what justice looks like over the course of the coming decades and work towards that. And that means that we must be equipped to make very, very difficult choices about the future we want to live in and how to get there. One of the things that Amartya Sen teaches us is that it's not enough for us to think of justice in a theoretical form. We really have to think of it in a practical form, and we have to make choices between legitimate but contestable needs. So this is a very important book to me personally because it's helped me to understand how we need to make choices between things that we often don't find palatable, for example, nuclear power, with our need to transition to a low carbon future. The next book I've decided to recommend to you, go ahead, is by Douglas Brinkley. And this is a book called American Moonshot. And the value of this book is that it tells us what is necessary in order to generate the ambition, the public-private partnerships, and the societal consensus that is needed when we seek to do great things. Obviously, you can see by the title, it traces the history of not only the United States, but also the Soviet Union, as each country sought to launch a man at the time into orbit and then subsequently to land on the moon. But the story that this book tells is a story that resonates and is relevant for what we're seeking to do today. For me, the two most important lessons of this book is, first and foremost, we cannot continue down the road of tribal politics on the issue of climate. We must build a societal consensus that takes the science seriously and understands the scale of ambition necessary to transform our economy. Because if we continue the cycle of boom and bust politics on this issue, we will be doomed to failure. But the second major lesson this book teaches is that we must have the public sector catalyzing innovation within the private sector in order to achieve our goals. Next book is by John Elkington, and this is a book called Green Swans. The reason I've chosen this particular book is because he is one of the pioneering thinkers about corporate sustainability. And he goes to great lengths in this particular book to explain not only his own successes, but also the ways in which he has failed throughout his career and the way he now needs to think again about the way he advocates for leadership in the private sector. And one of the most important lessons within this particular book is that we must change our mentality from what he calls a change as usual perspective to actually lead towards genuine transformation. A second major lesson in this book is he talks about how it's not enough for us to improve one individual company, but we must actually change the market as a whole. The next book that I'm suggesting is really about the solutions that are already available to us as we seek to transition to a low carbon future. This is a book edited by Paul Hawken. It brings together some of the finest experts on mitigation and decarbonization in the world, and it outlines 80 different measures across transport, energy, infrastructure, and food systems that we can all begin to take in order to get to decarbonization and a more food secure and resilient world. And then, as we now begin to get to the end of the list, it's important for us to think about our own personal resilience, because working on climate change is a very difficult journey for most of us to make. It involves dealing with one of the most pressing challenges on a daily basis and learning to live quite often with failure. So the reason I've suggested this particular book, called The Impossible Will Take a Little While, is because this is a series of vignettes of people who are working in social and environmental change, people who are working on suicide hotlines, for example, people who are working in the healthcare system, or even great transformational leaders like Nelson Mandela. And the key message from this book is that even in times of urgency, we need to have a degree of patience and we need to have a degree of personal resilience in order to continue to lead. Two final books. Greta Thunberg is recommended, in part because I wanted to recommend a book that reaches a younger constituency. One of the great values of this book is that she proves the point that you can become a powerful advocate for change when you come from nowhere at all. You don't need to be born into privilege, and you don't need to have connections in government. To borrow a phrase from earlier, you don't have to be the great insider. You can in fact be an insurgent from the outside and move mountains as a consequence of your passion, your sincerity, your authenticity, your commitment. And then finally, I wanted to recommend a book that tells us what not to do in this moment of crisis. This is a book by Reed Hunt that tells the story of the fiscal stimulus that was put in place after the financial crisis of 2008. It talks about how we missed a substantial opportunity in that time to build a better economy because we were too focused on building the economy as it had been pre-crisis, as opposed to reimagining what the economy ought to look like post-crisis. It is a book that tells the story of why conditionality is important and why we need to use the more than $5 trillion of stimulus that is already being baked into the system by the G20 to fundamentally change our economy as we go forward. That's it. They're the books that I'm recommending. They're all available from Northshire Bookstore. If anybody is interested, my email is on this screen. I'm very happy to have a further dialogue with anybody on this call about why I've selected those books or recommend further books. But for now, again, sincere thanks for including me in this conversation on Earth Day.
Thank you so much, Edward. That was wonderful. Let me get this screen share off. All right. Excellent. And let's hand things over to Gus.
Hi there, everybody. Thank you for joining, and thank you, Ed, for that remarkable presentation. I love those books. I know some of them, and have heard about all of them. So you've inspired me to go read more. I want to talk about Earth Day and where we are today. Here we are, 50 years after the first Earth Day. And the trajectory in general has been one from a great high on that day to a depressing low today when we look at where we are with the big issues in the environment. So we've gone from a moment of almost unbridled optimism to a reality that we're on the brink of ruining the planet. That's a hell of a transition. And I know about the optimism because I was on the mall 50 years ago with our 1-year-old daughter, and my wife and I were walking her around in the throng. Lost her one time, so we have to ask, how did this happen? what happened in those 50 years if we look at the big picture? Well, I think there are two areas that I want to comment on. One is those areas where we as a community of environmentally concerned people had very little control, where the system, where things were thrust in a way that affected the outcome upon us. And the other area, of course, is things that we could have done better and could have done differently. And there's a long list, which I won't go through it all. But let me take up these two areas. The fact is that we're really beyond our control, and they are extraordinarily powerful factors. And you might say that, well, we could get control of some of these if we had enough time and had focused there. But in many ways we didn't. But let me just give you a sense of what I have in mind. The first is that where we really lost ground and lost the environment is in this group of what I would call the 10 big global scale environmental challenges, notably climate, but biodiversity loss, and on down the list that you know. This is where we have failed miserably. And I think it's true to say that, and I've written a book about this, that these global scale issues are inherently difficult. And certainly that was one of the things that we are up against, was the extraordinarily difficult nature of these global scale problems like climate change. And it's often said that, well, we dealt with the ozone layer, we could deal with the climate issue. Well, what the ozone layer proves, if you really know the story, is how different the climate issue is. And I have a little quibble with Doug Brinkley in Ed's list, because I think the complexity of dealing with the climate issue, for example, in several of these global scale issues, is really far exceeds the complexity of putting a person on the moon. And indeed, there's even a book somewhere out there about why, I think the title is something like, how can we possibly succeed in putting someone on the moon and not deal with the serious social and environmental issues that we have? And the answer is that these issues are more difficult than the basically technological focused challenge of the moonshot. The second thing that's true, I think, is that we encountered very early on in the environmental area, and certainly by the time we began to take up the global scale issues, an extraordinary opposition, well-funded, sophisticated, committed to not allowing the things that we wanted to happen. And Ed mentioned dark money, and that's a big part of it. The well-financed opposition. A book I would add to the list is Judith Lazer's book, Open for Business. She was a professor at MIT and wrote a very good book on the rise of the business community opposition and the right-wing opposition to environmentalism. And so that certainly was, we were up against main force troops from the get-go. The third is that, we've had a series of intervening events which have captured tremendous public attention and money. And right now we see the coronavirus as another one. But before that, in this whole period of 50 years, there's been one huge galvanizing crisis after another. The war on terrorism, the Iraq war, and on and on. And these things have tended to eclipse, just as we have lost some of the focus and momentum in the Green New Deal today. We've had a history of these events. And the fourth and last thing is that during this period of 50 years, we have seen our political system, our democracy, rot. It has, I can, tell you that the Congress now is nothing like it was in 1970 when the Clean Air Act was written. And our politics are so degraded now. So it is right to stress the rebuilding of our democracy. But those are factors that have bedeviled our work and hampered our work and thwarted it in many, many areas. There were some things we could have done, though, differently. And I like to think that maybe we should think about what we did and didn't do in 1980. What happened in 1980 was we had had a previous decade of success in dealing with environmental issues. Remarkable success, in part because we stuck pretty closely to implementing two of the, really, several, but two in particular, of unique American laws. There's nothing in American jurisprudence, in my view, as powerful as the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act. They were demanding, they were command and control, and they grabbed the economy by the scruff of the neck and said, you've got to change. And we worked diligently in the 70s to get those acts implemented. And there were others, Endangered Species Act, National Environmental Policy Act. I'm not just reminiscing here, that was a moment in the 70s when things could change and get done. But what happened in 1980 was that Reagan was elected, and he ran against the environment. He campaigned against us, and in 1980, and won. And instead of taking a big step backwards and asking ourselves, are these things that we've been doing, or this environmentalism that we've created, is it really up to this new era? When in fact, what we did in the 70s was to burn down the political capital that had been built up. So we continued to work inside the Beltway, mostly as environmentalists, to work at the federal level, to use the courts, to work the agencies, the agency work, to work inside the bureaucracy, really, in a big way, and to hope for the best. But what we neglected badly was a movement into politics by environmentalists, a return to finding the grassroots that we had largely ignored in the 70s, to making alliances with frontline communities, labor, the poor, diversity, and those were the host of other interests that should have been allies with us, but we went on our own. And the diversity failing is one of the huge ones. We started white and we continued white. And so these failures, this is, in general, we failed to get the environmental community or American environmentalism out of the box that we had put ourselves in the 70s to get that job of implementing the great laws done. Things were very federalized. There was not enough attention at state and local levels, and we lost this ability to communicate with the public. We knew a lot about CAFE standards, prevention of significant deterioration, and on with this inside the Beltway jargon, but we didn't know how to reach the human heart of America on this issue, and we lost that. So we've been a lot going on more recently to try to recover from these shortcomings, but I think this contributed to our losses. The other big area for loss, for mistake, in the late 60s, and throughout a lot of the 60s, there were people like Barry Commoner and others. Commoner wrote a great book called The Closing Circle, and they pointed out, as the environmental community was building up this capital, that there really was a system problem. That the reason that we were in such bad shape is that we had a system of political economy that wasn't really trying to do much about these problems and wouldn't allow it to happen. And so they were deeply critical, and Paul Ehrlich and John Holdren wrote a great book called Human Ecology at that point, and others. They pointed out that what we had here was a system failure, and we had to change the system. We had to build a new political economy. And so we left that behind. That learning, that wisdom, we never really, really pursued into the 70s and 80s, and it was left into some academic thinking. But you know, we should have recognized that we had a political economy that prioritized not the well-being of real people and a real planet, but it prioritized power, profit, production, growth, and it still does today in spades. So we should have gone after the system. So in my view, what we need is a new environmentalism, and among other things. And this, one way to look at it is, we need to ask again, what is an environmental issue? To ask that question. What is an environmental issue? What is an environmental problem? And, you know, traditionally the answers have always been that same list of climate change and biodiversity loss and pollution and others. But what if you change the answer to that question and say that, you know, a real environmental problem are those things that prevent us from succeeding as environmentalists, and ask ourselves, you know, what are the underlying causes of our failure? And, you know, when you reframe the question that way, then, you know, an environmental issue is our failing democracy, not something that the environmental groups attend to very much at all. An environmental issue is the extraordinary deprivation of at least half the American people, and probably more, which is you know, the people are scared, and they're scared of what environmental changes, including climate change, might do to them. They're getting scared of what climate change is doing to them, but the actions are still scary to a lot of people. Our runaway consumerism, again, an issue that's not much addressed by the environmental community, but you know, most of GDP is consumption, and the growth is a tremendous burden on environment. So we have this growth mania and these other issues that are at the root of environmental failure. And environmental communities, in my view, to build this new environmentalism, has got to find a way to break out finally of this cocoon that we built much earlier, and to take on this core issue of the failure of the American system. And in doing that, we see that this failure is the same failure that accounts for the vast inequality, the vast insecurity, the tremendous burden on marginal communities and the poor in our society. It's all one problem, and we need to form this grand alliance to deal with it. And we need to do it by November for sure. So thank you. That's my preaching for the day.
Well, thank you so much, Gus. That was terrific and wonderful things to think about. I'd like to open it up for questions. If anyone has any questions, whether for either of our presenters, as you're thinking, you can unmute yourself, you can type it into the chat, and as you're thinking about it, maybe I've got a question for Gus. We have seen lately, now that with the start of now that the pandemic is going on, this drastic decline in pollution. We're seeing the Himalayas from India. We're seeing the floor bed of the Venetian lagoon. How long is that going to last, or is that going to inspire us to change?
Well, it might inspire us. It's a hell of a costly way to go about cleaning up what we're experiencing now, and it's certainly not the right way, and not a way to emulate into the future. For God knows. I think, we are at a juncture where we could learn from this. And there are some big lessons, including some very practical political lessons that we could learn. And we could use this moment as part of the building of a transformation, a building towards a transformation. Or we could see this thing go really bad. I think that's the nub of it. We're at this hinge, this point of bifurcation. And what are we going to get out of it? And I don't want to be too political, but I don't mind being a little political. If well, why not be political? I think if we don't succeed in getting a different president in office, then we'll, the odds are, so much higher that the net outcome of this is going to be disaster rather than a positive transition. So, we only have a few months now, and whatever one's persuasion or politics had been, I think for the sake of our children and grandchildren and our country and our democracy and the climate, we've got to get rid of this guy and get somebody in there who has a soul. In terms of system change, we have an organization now that we founded a few years ago that's trying to deal with this in a kind of think tank way. And it's called the Next System Project. It has a website, the Next System, well, it's called, thenextsystem.org. And there's some brilliant staff members who've been working on a whole host of ideas for pursuing this, and have written a great deal about it. And most of it's on the website of this organization. Part of that has been the collection of about 30 envisionings of an alternative political economy. Alternative political economies, I should say. The ideas are quite different, some of them, from others. So we've collected these now in the book that's coming out, called, A New System Reader. And it's going to be a collection of these 30 essays, including one by me, but even better, people. It's quite provocative. The visions range all the way from sort of a Sweden squared to really doing away with the market altogether and new forms, a totally different form of enterprise and relating enterprises together and other things. So they deal with most of the great issues, and that will come out hopefully this year. It was due over the summer, but maybe the fall now. But there's a lot of great ideas for very practical action on this website of the Next System Project. I had something to say about but it slipped my mind about the other issues that you raised. But maybe it'll come back.
There's a great question in the chat from Stephanie. She asked, how do we talk about addressing climate change during these times when so many of our neighbors can only think about how they're going to feed their families in the fallout of the pandemic? Our state legislature is poised to pass 3 major climate action bills. And Stephanie says she feels like this is all going to be thwarted now. How do we proceed? How do we connect the dots for our fellow Vermonters and country people?
Yeah, well, I think this is so important. I mean, we've seen the legislation in the Vermont legislature go on pause. Hopefully that's all it is a pause, but they're not making a lot of progress right now. And we've seen a lot of deflection of attention away from the national momentum that we were getting in the campaign with the candidates having very, impressive, really, climate platforms, and the evolution of a lot of new activist groups getting into the climate issue, including at the local level. For example, a group that I'm very partial to, the Climate Mobilization, which is trying to use the model of World War II mobilization to influence how we think and go about climate action, but also go about it at the local level. And they, so we've lost tremendous ground. People are suffering tremendously, and that's why those very people that you described, who are having grave difficulties today, is precisely the reason I'm not particularly partial to pointing out the fact that we can see the Himalayas and the pollution is down. It's just too awful a way of going about getting to those goals. I think God bless Bernie, he had a hell of a climate plan. And I think one of the big things that we have to do now is to be sure that Vice President Biden picks up the key features of his plan and the others, and puts them into this thing. I think there's going to be a big climate vote, and Biden would be crazy not to run with this issue. So that's the beginning of action. Beyond that, at every turn, I think we need to build the transition to a new political economy into what we're doing on climate. And that a lot of the thinking that our Next System project has worked on is how to do that. Including.
Can I just also make a point quickly about why we failed and what we maybe ought to do next. My view is that we've often failed because we have been focusing on the wrong things. So to give you a very tangible illustration, at the beginning of this administration, President Trump decided to withdraw from the Paris Agreement. So the whole environmental community moved to try and prevent that from happening, and consequently ignored entirely the packing of the federal court. Now, one of the things that Gus has mentioned is that one of the most important tools that we have in our armory is the Clean Air Act. And in fact, all the progress we've made on climate change in the last 5 years rests with Massachusetts versus EPA, a court case from 2007, which said that greenhouse gases should be regulated like a pollutant under the Clean Air Act. And that gave President Obama the executive authority he needed to put in place various measures in our energy and transportation systems, and helped us to negotiate internationally the Paris Agreement. If we see that court case overruled, then not only do we undermine a current president from leading on this issue, but we undermine the capacity of future presidents to lead on this issue too. So that is a very tangible example from my perspective of how we as a community have focused on the wrong issues. At the same time, right now, I see that pattern emerging again. The G20 countries have already decided that they're going to spend $5 trillion in stimulus. And I would argue that that will reach 10 trillion by the end of this year, and will turn into many tens of trillions before this crisis plays itself out. And what we need to be doing as a community is not thinking about what is the next piece of legislation that will pass the Vermont State House. We need to be thinking about what is public spending and fiscal policy and the taxation system doing to either entrench a high carbon future or transition to a low carbon future. So for me, part of the problem is we simply have not had the right influence strategy. We've sought to change the wrong types of systems. We have a real economy out there of $90 trillion. And unless we change the way that $90 trillion global economy works, through changed consumption patterns, through changed production patterns, through changing investment patterns, then anything we do is going to be piecemeal by comparison. Perhaps I'll speak to experience. And again, I'm sorry some of you on the call have heard me say this before, but I originally was sent to the United States to work for the government of the Maldives, and I was located in Washington, D.C. And it was my job to go to Capitol Hill and advocate for climate leadership, the Maldives, of course, being a country that faces extinction as a consequence of this problem. And I found that when I would go and speak about environment, a certain number of Democrats would listen to me and everyone else would close their door. So over time, I decided that each time I returned to the Hill, I would change what I called my vocabulary of arguments. I would speak about faith. I would speak about competitiveness. I would speak about human rights. I would speak about women's empowerment. I would speak about national security issues. And the lesson that I learned and the advice that I would give is, we've got to speak to people about what incentivizes and motivates and resonates with them. And as a community, I think we have not been good communicators. We have spoken in the language of jargon, but we've also talked about what excites us. And what we need to do is to speak about what excites other people. We need to speak about job creation. We need to speak about livelihood generation. We need to speak about public health. We need to talk about educational attainment and social mobility. All of those things that matter to people right now are the same things that always matter to people. And I think the only way that we can do that is if we learn not to only speak about this in the language of ecology. The final point that I would make on this issue is, I've personally become convinced, essentially along the lines of what Violet has just said, that our only way to succeed on this issue is through a form of societal consensus. Because if we only have 50% of the population with us on this, we're always going to go through that cycle of replacing a Democrat with a skeptical Republican. And that means that we will simply run down the clock on this issue. So I don't believe for a second that we can convince the last 10% of holdouts, because they have a vested interest in continuing with the economy as is. But we at least need to build our coalition beyond what it is now. And that means we need a conservative agenda on climate change and not just a liberal Democrat one.
Broader the consensus we can bring into climate action, the better. I do think we have to be aware that things are changing very fast, though. I mean, not only have we really run out of time, way beyond time, but the political opportunities have changed. And let me just mention two things. Our group has been advocating what seemed like a radical proposal, which was that the federal government buy out the fossil fuel industry and close it down over time. And people, initially when we floated these ideas, and we have worked to explain how that could happen in a responsible way, but now it's really caught on. And now with the price of a barrel of oil being negative, the idea is going to eventually become attractive to the fossil fuel industry. I think this is a real possibility now, and it was a very, very remote possibility a short while ago. The other thing is that we constantly face the idea that, well, it's too expensive to do this, that, and the other. And we've just had an existence proof that it isn't too expensive to do things, that the combination of the Treasury and the Fed can create trillions of dollars out of whole cloth without any real prospect of the debt on that being, repaid out of tax money or other burdens of that type. So this modern monetary theory, which again seemed like a kind of chimera out there, is in fact, in a de facto way being implemented. We have no problem, when Bernie and others say we need to spend, multiple trillions on the climate area, we should. There's no legitimacy now in saying it's too expensive. We've just seen, trillions of dollars be created out of whole cloth, and unless you. So I think these are dramatic changes in particularly the latter in our understanding of what's possible.
Well, there are many other great questions that I've gotten here, but I did want to save it some time here at the end for Gus's new book of poetry, which, as I've said, it's called What We Have Instead. I'm going to put a link to it up in the chat, or maybe Rachel will. He chose to publish this with Northshire's own Shires Press. And since publication, it has been featured in the holiday issue of the New York Review of Books, one of the really great magazines. And I want to share this brief blurb from the Valley News. Speth's poems bring an eye for telling detail and a unique outlook, musings on politics, history, aging, and forgiveness, and milestones, both triumphant and tragic. So thank you all for joining us, and I thought let's end with some poetry. So Gus, please share with us. Thank you.
Well, thank you, David. Before everybody runs away, let me reassure you that this is going to be very short, and I'm going to stick to some very short poems and not many. I want to begin with one that deals with the climate issue, and it's called What He Could Have Done. He could have pitched a tent in Lafayette Square and fasted until action was taken on climate change. He thought about it many times. Imagine reporters seeking his views as he sat outside his little tent. Yet even his fantasy moved to the possibility of fasting away instead in a Hay Adams room overlooking the park. No reason not to be comfortable, and besides, he'd get more reporters that way. Along with water, he thought, should I take a vitamin pill every day? Amid the great suffering of the world, he'd lived a life of worldly comfort. He did a bit of time in jail for protesting the end of the world as we know it. Not risking everything is a strategy that ends with grandkids deprived. He knows that now, deeply knows. This is no time for self-deception, but will he act on his convictions? Ends in a question. And we're in Vermont, and it wouldn't be right not to say a word about a poem about Vermont. Here's one is, I think you'll see yourself in it perhaps right away. And note that it has a date, so to speak. It's a morning around New Year's Day. Real Vermonters love a morning like this, a land of ice and snow, clear, crisp, and 5 below. The purple shadows from big bare maples reach out across the slopes and rolls. The big balsam bows with their new white coat, while the birdhouses wear their snow caps and the swings try out their new white loads as the wind gives easy pushes. Once green everything, now everywhere white except the red of sumac. The deer will browse at dusk, but now what moves are the chickadees flitting and flying with their friends the juncos. There are a few goldfinch at the feeders, but they left their gold somewhere safe. The dogs bark when the long-hanging roof ice drops in a noisy plump. It's a beautiful day for a walk on the road or to head out with skis or snowshoes, and also very nice to return to a warm, sweet-smelling house. Still, my wife and I were raised in warmer climes. In a month or so, we'll be chilled enough to take out of the refrigerator and enjoyed by friends and family on the beach in Carolina, which was where I'm from, my wife too. And then, you see a lot these days about people seeking pets. And those who haven't have a pet are going down to the rescue to get one. And there are a lot of people who have pets, particularly dogs, who are very glad they have at this moment. So I have a poem about a dog. It's called In Bed. My dog has positional anxiety. He awakes and moves quite quietly around and around and around, making small circles on his bed, searching for just the right place to first put his rear and then his head, one that feels satisfactory. Complicating the situation is his friend on the cushion. Once a pup, barely tolerated, she's now too big a friend to be pushed and relegated to a small corner at the end. If a dog can worry so about taking the right position, and how to relate to another. Imagine then the human condition when it comes to sharing the cover. I thought you'd smile with that. And then we have the beaches are very much in our lives, in our consciousness these days, with issues about beach closings but we all have probably had some great times at the beach with our families. And here's a poem called "A Place of Little Pretense." This small beach house was built in 1951, just across the dunes from the big breakers, facing the full Atlantic through a few palmettos. It has survived the ferocity of many encounters, including the direct hit of the big storm Hugo. It has survived thousands of children tracking in tons of sand and wet bathing suits. It has been the enduring, strong cauldron for explosions of laughter and love and anger. His tiny kitchen has seen the endless shucking of local oysters and the frying of many flounder. How many books have been read here? How much coffee spilled into the rugs? How many exhibitions of grandkids' art? How many hugs? How many castles washed away by the waves? How many games of Monopoly and cards? How many kids body surf to dad's legs? How many carbs? How many shark teeth found near the surf? How many dogs slept in the chairs? How many bare feet warmed by the sand? How many beers? The signs of age are all around. Tiny worn sinks in upstairs bedrooms. A bottom floor flat on the ground. A very small toilet in the bathroom. The walls and ceilings of full bare pine. The medicine cabinet with a slit in the back. The razor blades there to oblivion assigned. There's mold around the edges and corners. Lots of rust from sitting in salt air. And the boards worn out around the dormers. This house is a modest place on the beach, yet pilgrims trek here each summer. It's a state of mind they hope to reach, to see again their families and each other, to watch birds, to catch some fish, to worship the tanning sun, and the boys look at girls and wish. I have only one more. And it's one of my favorites. It's about activism. It's a fight song. It's called "Banners Yet to Be Unfurled." The snow lies lightly on the lilac round by the kitchen door. The juncos peck in stone cracks, endless in their search for more. I think that's my way too, to keep the search going on. What else could I really do but find new ways to scorn? As Camus said of Sisyphus, who toiled with his stone, there is no fate for us that can't be beat by scorn. And so I scorn what passes here today for equality and justice before the law, for helping the poor to find a way, for promises the troops will be soon withdrawn. Most politicians are pathetic souls. Almost every sentence is a lie. Recognition is their main goal. To integrity, they've said goodbye. Oh, purple mountain majesty. Oh, fruited plain of amber grain. The machine crushes endlessly everything for investments gained. And so we search for ways to fight. We see the beauty of the snow, but we know to make it right may require our blood to flow. We've seen the heads bandaged round, the men and women tiered by gas. Each has earned a special crown. They know the system will not last. Scorn, rage, and many actions, protests coming around the world. Today we see but a fraction of banners yet to be unfurled. Well, that's a fight song, if you're ready for it.
Yes, thank you so much. You're a man of parts. We really appreciate it. The book is What We Have Instead. You can order it online at www.northshire.com. Likewise, go to events and you can take a look at this event, and we have a list there of the books that Edward recommended, along with Gus's. Thank you all so much. Have a good rest of your 50th Earth Day. Thank you, Gus. Thank you, Edward. And take care, everyone. Appreciate it. See you tomorrow if you want to join us then for Tara Shea Nesbitt and Ken Van Alkemede. Thanks again, www.northshire.com. Thanks very much.
Thank you, David. And thank you, Ed.
Thanks, everybody. Pleasure.